Next topic here is embryonic stem cell research. Now, this is a topic that probably got a lot more attention maybe 20 years ago even than it does right now. I remember it was a very big thing at the beginning of the presidency of George W. Bush because it was a question of whether there would be federal funding for this particular type of research. So what that involves, embryonic stem cell research would involve taking a human embryo, often one of these surpluses from in vitro fertilization, intentionally destroying the embryo's life, destroying the embryo, and basically being able to create a cell line, being able to sort of copy cells from this embryo. And the question arose at some point of saying, okay, should the government fund this research? Because there were so many promises, people said, from embryonic stem cell research. But the funding that would be involved to get there was more than what the private companies were willing to take that kind of gamble on. So the thought was whether the government should fund it. And the church was against government funding there for the simple idea that it would encourage more embryos to be destroyed in this way, that it would create more of that kind of destruction. Ultimately, I think what President Bush did was he said something like, we'll fund embryos that were, the cell lines that were created before a certain date, but not after this date or whatever, so that some of that incentive would be taken out. In many ways, not a perfect solution, but that's what happened at the time. But be clear, it was never a question about whether it was illegal. The scientists were not going to be taken to jail for doing it. It was just a question of whether your tax dollars and mine were going to fund it. We're going to be part of continuing that to happen. Sometimes you'll hear people say the church opposes stem cell research. That's an incomplete and thus inaccurate statement. We do not oppose stem cell research from what are called adult stem cells, which means stem cells taken from the umbilical cord, from the placenta after birth, from certain blood cells and such along the way. It was the question of the embryonic stem cell research. Bone marrow, that was another great source of stem cells. And so I've known people who had, I'm blanking, I want to say Parkinson's disease, who had some treatment from some stem cells, and it was from bone marrow-derived stem cells. And I said, fantastic, that's wonderful, glad you got that. Again, it's the embryonic stem cells, the ones that destroy a human embryo. Thankfully, what's happened along the way, as much as this was a big controversy in the early 2000s, around November 2007, there was a breakthrough, so to speak, that allowed us to reprogram adult stem cells, again, those from blood or from bone marrow or whatever, to make them pluripotent, to make them malleable, so to speak, to do different things. Because that was always the promise with the embryonic cells, was that they were so malleable you could form them into anything. And at one time, blood cells could only become blood cells, brain cells could only become brain cells, etc. But I bring all this up, even though it's not as much of a hot topic today, it is another part of that reasoning process, that thought process, if you will. Because this, if you have the sheet, that bottom of page 2 there, I said, if an embryo will be destroyed anyway, why can't we just use it for research? Why can't we get some good out of it? Well, we would never want to kill one person, even if that person is going to die soon anyway. If I choose to kill that person, it's a difference between the person possibly dying on his or her own versus me being the agent of that person's death. And if I become the agent of one person's death, even in the small embryo that's smaller than the period at the end of a sentence, if I become an agent in that person's death, will I be more easily able to become the agent in other people's deaths? Will I change myself into the kind of person that's more able to take a life? Even beyond just, again, the initial embryo question. Because every one of our actions forms our character, right? Everything that we do affects what we're going to do in the future. That's where, right now we're in Lent, and sometimes people find they give up a certain thing for Lent, or they take on a new practice, and Easter comes along, and they're like, you know what, I've really gained a lot from praying the rosary every day. I'm going to keep on doing that. Or I don't really need that, hour of Netflix or 2 hours of Netflix or whatever I was watching before Lent. I can continue to go without it. I have now formed myself into the kind of person who can go without that. So our actions, again, they form our character. They form what we're likely to do or not do in the future. And so we don't want to start killing embryos in order to benefit from them, because soon after that we start killing others, killing one to sort of save another along the way.